So I would want to know what Paulogia says.
Even though it was a full year ago, it's always gratifying when a prominent Christian author like Dr. Gary Habermas takes the time to address me by name. After all, I'm just a YouTuber.
YouTube is just, it's YouTubers.
Yeah, we're not so great.
I've never been introduced, and I don't see a lot of people introduced as the star of a YouTube channel.
Paulogia, he's a atheist YouTuber.
Well, I know lots of content creators who are more focused on how many people are watching and what they can produce to increase that number.
And he's got a pretty decent sized following. I think he's got a few thousand more than we do right now.
The other thing about YouTube or any kind of video is that very few channels on YouTube, at least the apologetics channels that I'm watching, are driven by the content of the host alone. Far more are derivative.
Derivative? What do you mean?
What I mean is, they are interviewing somebody.
Today on Capturing Christianity, I am interviewing Dr. Gary Habermas.
They're dependent upon the existence of the people they are consistently interviewing.
So, Gary, it's great to have you back. You've been on the show a couple times.
They themselves would not be able to do enough content to go out by themselves over a long period of time, so they find themselves interviewing people who can provide that type of content.
His main areas of research include the philosophical study of miracles, near-death experiences, which we actually just got a question about that.
And so they are largely interview platforms. And who are they interviewing? Mostly authors.
He's the author or co-author of over 40 books.
Come on, Jim. The interviewer has some work to do. I mean, they have to come up with the questions.
This is more of just a Q&A with him.
Meh, I tried. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. While I try to keep up with new content from influential Christians, there are far too many multi-hour live streams to catch them all. But it recently came to my attention that last July, the world's leading Jesus resurrection scholar took a few minutes to address me personally.
All right, so here's a question from Jannard. He says, can you ask what Dr. Gary Habermas thinks about Paulogia's theory?
Excellent question, Jannard. Thank you.
His theory, if I have it correctly, is that only Peter and Paul had experiences of Jesus.
Close. My observation is that there is no compelling historical data that requires more than Peter and Paul to have had an experience of risen Jesus. Again, Peter and Paul alone are sufficient to explain all the relevant historical facts. I've actually directly asked Gary if any such evidence exists to refute this observation. I'll put a link to that video in the description so you can see what he said at the time.
So he avoids any kind of like group hallucinations.
Sure he does.
He kind of gets out of that, yeah.
Sure he does.
Yes, this realization renders one of your resurrection defenses to be irrelevant. That's a you problem, not a me problem.
Anytime I can categorize another view and lop off their most evidential areas, then tell them the non-evidential parts are the one I'm willing to admit.
Wait, is Gary suggesting that the post-resurrection appearances to Peter and Paul are the non-evidential parts? And that the appearances to not Peter and Paul are the parts with the evidence? He can't mean that, can he? Buckle in, everyone. This should be good.
And by the way, you can't prove the non-evidential part.
To be fair, it's tough to prove anything non-evidential.
Sure, if I can circumscribe a view and take the evidential portions off, I'm going to be better off.
Per every Gary Habermas lecture I've ever heard, Peter and Paul have the best evidence, including the best attestations of martyrdom. So I have no idea what he's talking about here.
And by the way, he's nowhere near new on that. If he wants to see the word of somebody who's been doing this for his whole life.
Well, that sounds like homework. But that's okay. I enjoy researching this stuff. Lay it on me, Gary.
That view maybe he gets it from other people, but that view has been held by Don Cupid.
Don Cupid was an Anglican priest, professor of religion, and scholar of Christian theology at the University of Cambridge. Currently 87 years old, you can find snippets of him on YouTube, including his BBC television documentary series called Sea of Faith, where he challenged many orthodox Christian beliefs.
And he applied his mythical interpretation even to the resurrection. He knew there'd be trouble.
In his 1971 book, Cupid divides resurrection discussion into two schools: event theory, where belief in risen Jesus was sparked by an inciting incident after Jesus' death, and theological theory, where belief in risen Jesus is rather a theological conclusion based on beliefs about the life of Jesus, without an inciting event. Even as partially summarized by the show's question reader, it should be clear to Gary that my hypothesis would be an event theory in this paradigm, that Peter and Paul had some kind of experience. However, Cupid's book rejects all event theories outright, and he holds firmly to the theological side. In a written exchange with Professor Mule of Cambridge, starting in August of 1971, Cupid defended his view that Christianity, including his own faith, does not require, and likely did not originate, from a physical resurrection of Jesus, but rather a theological revelation of an eternal Jesus emerged from belief in the salvific nature of Jesus. In Cupid's view, a confident internal sense of a risen Jesus is for some a side product of faith.
Some reviewers say I'm skeptical about the Easter stories. No, I'm agnostic about them. All I say is that the Easter stories are not to be taken as reasons for believing in the Easter faith, but rather as picturesque expressions of the Easter faith. I think that the Christophany experiences were common concomitants of the dawn of the Easter faith in many or most of the first Christians. It was the novelty and startlingness of the new faith that generated them. But a blessing was also promised to those who did not see and yet believed. I say the same about the resurrection appearances. I don't deny they happened, I don't know. But I'm sure they cannot be made to make a useful contribution to apologetic. They ought not, especially nowadays, to be introduced into an argument intended to justify the Easter faith, because they confuse the issue.
This is a fascinating idea, but Cupid would call my observation about the explanatory sufficiency of Peter and Paul an event theory, which he rejects. In fact, when he mentions Peter,
what matters is not whether Peter saw Jesus alive then, but whether I see him alive now. And I can see him now just as Peter saw him then, though I'll use different language to tell of it.
And Paul?
Look at Paul's life and thought as a whole, and you will understand the part which the Damascus Road experience played in his development. This gets us away from the bad old idea of miracles as violations of the laws of nature, and helps us instead to see the Christophany to Paul as a kind of close-packed argument, putting in a nutshell a turning point in his life, crystallizing his life hitherto and setting him on his future course.
Rather than agreeing with me by singling out these two apostles of having seen something unique, Cupid argues that Peter and Paul came to a theological conclusion no more unique than any other believer in history, including Christians today.
It has been held by the early Schillebeeckx, a Danish philosopher.
Edward Schillebeeckx was a Roman Catholic theologian who lived from 1914 to 2009. In his 1991 book, Jesus, an Experiment in Christology, Schillebeeckx is convinced that the empty tomb and appearance traditions are later developments in the early church history meant to give figurative language around the post-crucifixion Jesus, actively revealing himself to believers in a spiritual and theological way. When it comes to the creed in 1 Corinthians 15,
Paul then gives a list of persons, all of whom are voicing the same resurrection kerygma.
According to Schillebeeckx, the Greek word translated "he appeared" in this passage would be better translated "make epiphanis," observing that the Greek translation of Genesis that was available in the first century used this same word in cases where nothing was visible.
That is obviously what Paul means by this off. God caused Jesus to be seen by all the people aforementioned. For all these apostles Jesus has become epiphanis, that is, they are all proclaiming the one crucified has risen.
Like Cupid, Schillebeeckx does not single out Peter and Paul as having had a unique experience, but affirms that all of them experienced the same non-physical revelation of Jesus. I'm not sure why Gary thinks this parallels my view, as described by the question reader.
It's held by Willi Marxsen, the Bultmannian New Testament scholar.
Gary is speaking of Willi Marxsen, born in 1919. A German theologian and professor. By Bultmannian, Gary means that Marxsen's views were similar to, or patterned after, those of Rudolf Bultmann, a prominent figure in the form criticism and demythologizing of the New Testament in the early 20th century. In 1968, Marxsen published a book called The Resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, where he lays out his denial that the resurrection of Jesus was a historical event. Rather, it was merely the message of earthly Jesus that lived on. The figurative continuation of Jesus' ministry that began Christianity eventually became reinterpreted as a literal continuation, and this misunderstanding became codified in the Gospels. Marxsen agrees with me that Peter's convictions would have been sufficient to explain the history of Christianity before Paul hit the scene.
Even though this incident is almost certainly unhistorical, it brings out the priority of Peter's faith. There is therefore no reason to doubt that Peter really was the first to believe in Jesus after Good Friday. With this, we have arrived at a question which is of the greatest importance for our whole theme. Did Jesus have to appear to the others before they were able to believe? Of course, I am well aware that this question cannot be precisely answered. Who is to say what is necessary? Yet the question has a heuristic value, because it helps us to discover what the vision accomplishes, in any given case, and what it does not, or no longer needs to, accomplish. For anyone who maintains that Jesus had to appear to the other disciples before they were able to believe must be consistent. He must then be prepared to agree that nobody can find faith, even at the present day, unless he has experienced an appearance of Jesus. But this is a proposition which hardly anyone would maintain. But it is essential to add that an appearance was not necessary in order that the 10 should believe, for they believed before. And this means that their faith too was dependent on the appearance to Peter. What is the point of the narrative? I think it is this: their faith, the manifold functions which they exercised, are all in the ultimate resort based on the first appearance to Peter. They are all summed up in this appearance.
Marxsen doesn't think we can make any conclusions about the nature of Paul's vision, but instead laid out a nuanced case that Paul's belief ultimately stemmed from Peter's belief, regardless.
That's held by John Shelby Spong.
In a 2014 interview, Bishop John Shelby Spong said,
"I don't think the resurrection has anything to do with physical resuscitation," he said. "I think it means the life of Jesus was raised back into the life of God, not into the life of this world, and that it was out of this that his presence, not his body, was manifested to certain witnesses."
Like me, he suspects the whole endeavor began with Peter, which his book Resurrection, Myth or Reality describes in narrative fashion.
Suddenly it all came together for Simon. The crucifixion was not punitive, it was intentional. The cross was Jesus' ultimate parable, acted out on the stage of history to open the eyes of those whose eyes could be opened in no other way to the meaning of Jesus as the sign of God's love. God's love was unconditional, a love not earned by the rigorous keeping of the law. God's love was beyond the boundaries of righteousness, a love that demanded nothing in return. Jesus' death was the final episode in the story of his life. It demonstrated as nothing else could or would that it is in giving life away that we find life, it is in giving love away that we find love, it is in embracing the outcast that we find ourselves embraced as outcasts. It was a love that allowed us to stop pretending and simply to be. Simon saw the meaning of the crucifixion that morning as he had never before seen it, and Simon felt himself to be embraced even with his doubts, his fears, his denials in a way that he had never before been embraced. That was the dawn of Easter in human history. It would be fair to say that in that moment Simon felt resurrected. The clouds of his grief, confusion, and depression vanished from his mind, and in that moment he knew that Jesus was part of the very essence of God, and at that moment Simon saw Jesus alive.
People like Gary insist that when Paul adds himself to the list of the resurrection witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15, that he must therefore be indicating that his vision was also a really real bodily Jesus. But Bishop Spong asks, what if the opposite were true?
I would argue that if Paul's words are read apart from the distorting images of the Gospels, these witnesses were the recipients of revelatory visions of the living Christ exalted at God's right hand. Paul gave us the earliest official church chronicle of those who, like himself, stood ready to bear witness that the Lord lived, that the Lord had made himself visible to them, and that they had seen the Lord.
So for Spong, all the so-called witnesses merely became enlightened to a theological conclusion, with Peter being the first to do so.
Versions of that.
I mean, kind of. My hypothesis, and all four of these scholars, put forth that a belief in a resurrection does not require an actual resurrection. So in that, we would all be versions of a non-event theory, as Cupid would categorize them.
The problem is they try to get it down to just Peter and Paul.
Trying to get it down? Cupid and Schillebeeckx would say there is nothing special about Peter and Paul. To them, all the so-called witnesses equally came to the same purely theological conclusions that were later rebranded. As for Marxsen and Spong, they merely acknowledge an observation that should be obvious to anyone who looks at church history critically, that there's no fact about the spread of Christianity that requires more than Peter to have kicked things off and Paul to carry the torch down the road. Keep in mind that Marxsen and Spong remained committed Christians their entire lives and careers. These aren't men with secular bias looking to discredit Jesus.
But you know what? That same list of 1 Corinthians 15, which we also haven't talked about, why it's so early.
The only solid evidence for how early that passage is that it predates Paul's letter to the Corinthians, written in the 50s AD, about 20 years after the death of Jesus. How much earlier is the realm of speculation, though. For me, even if Gary wants to date it to the week after the crucifixion, it still merely reflects the beliefs of early Christians. The non-event proposals by Cupid, Schillebeeckx, Marxsen, Spong, myself, or many others don't require any more time to pass than an actual resurrection would.
But 1 Corinthians 15 is unanimous. Well, unanimous is too strong. The consensus New Testament view, even by skeptics, the consensus New Testament view is that creed was formulated probably, let me just use Bart Ehrman, that creed and others like it.
Remind me to make a video sometime about the other early creeds. The authors Gary gave me to read make some excellent points about how the others demonstrate that the 1 Corinthians Creed could be a late development.
It was probably in existence in Jerusalem.
Since Gary wants to invoke Dr. Ehrman here to support his claims, let's see what this New Testament scholar wrote on his blog about the matter.
I've talked about it a bit, mainly to say I have no idea how someone can possibly come up with the view that this was circulating 6 years after Jesus' death. What are the grounds for that? It's really an apologetic claim more than anything else. All we know is that this was a creed that Paul preached to the Corinthians at some point. In any event, there is zero evidence that the 12 used this creed.
Possibly from the apostles.
Dr. Ehrman?
Among scholars I personally know, except for evangelicals, I don't know anyone who thinks this at all. And for a good reason. Paul never says he got this creed from Peter and James 3 years after his conversion. Doesn't even suggest it. People just make this stuff up. Also, there weren't church creeds back then. Every church had its own ways of thinking, believing, and saying things, nothing at all like a uniform liturgy until centuries later when Christianity became a unified worldwide movement. People like William Lane Craig may say this kind of thing. But you need to think carefully about the logic, especially in light of what we do know about the massive diversity of the earliest Christian churches. By the way, if Peter and James came up with this creed, why would it be the 12 instead of the 11? That's not a major point, but it's worth thinking about. Even if Paul didn't know about Judas, they certainly would have.
And in existence before Paul was on his way to Damascus. In other words, it's very, very early.
Dr. Ehrman?
All I'm saying is that if someone wants to make a specific argument, e.g., that this is a confession that originated 6 years after Jesus' death, they have to have evidence of it. I don't know of any. So the person who uses this fact in order to establish another point has a problem.
It doesn't seem like Bart is with you on this, Gary.
Why am I making a big deal of 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following? Because in that list of appearances, there's 3 group appearances. So I would want to know what Paulogia says. Why does he take Paul and Peter out of that list? And by the way, Paul adds his name to the list. But why does he take Peter and Paul out of this? There's also James. Why does he leave those in? I said it wrong. Why does he leave those in and take the 3 group appearances out?
That's an excellent question, Gary. But you're basing it on a faulty premise. I'm not selectively affirming parts of this creed that I like and leaving out parts that I don't, though I can understand why it might look so from your vantage point. Now, I reject the entire 1 Corinthians 15 creed as merely a statement of faith from somewhere in the first 20 years of Christianity. My conclusion that Peter and Paul likely experienced something comes from entirely different evidence. in much the same way that my acceptance that Barack Obama was president of the United States doesn't come from the comic book where he meets Spider-Man. Paul affirms his vision in his own writing. In fact, he's the only person in any extant writings from the first century to provide a first-person report of seeing risen Jesus in any form. No other author even makes such a first-hand claim. Not even Peter. So why do I put forth Peter? Well, some version of Christianity definitely predates Paul, since he persecuted them, so it was started by someone. The details are too much for this video, but the prevalence of Petrine priority in the early writings and traditions, along with the well-established conflicts between Peter and Paul as church authorities, has me thinking that he's a good candidate. My central thesis doesn't actually rest on the single originator being Peter, but he's a reasonable candidate.
A lot of them who talk about it, here's what they say. Oh, because groups don't see things like that. Well, thank you. You just argued in a circle.
I don't know what circular arguers you're referring to, Gary, but that's not me. I don't think there are group appearances because there isn't sufficient evidence for them. In fact, I'm engaged with a lengthy written debate with Dr. Andrew Loke on that very topic, and Gary's straw man here hasn't come up a single time. But it made the question reader laugh, so Gary's got at least one person buying in.
The same data, they're going to say that Peter and James and Paul claim to see the risen Jesus.
Paul claims to have seen the risen Jesus. We have no document where either Peter or James claims to see the risen Jesus, even if we accept these men as having written their New Testament books, which I don't. You're wrong on this, Gary.
Are going to say that they were appeared. The most heavily evidenced appearance is to the 12 apostles. That's the one with the best evidence.
I don't see how. It's first mentioned in that creed we've talked about. The Gospel of Mark has no appearances of any kind. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus appears to the remaining disciples on a mountain in Galilee. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus appears to the remaining disciples gathered in Jerusalem, then leads them to Bethany and ascends to heaven. The Gospel of John has two appearances, one without Thomas and one with Thomas. Despite the fact that massive swaths of the Gospels are copied from each other, word for word, they don't remotely corroborate each other on appearances of the 12 in any way. This isn't like one witness remembering the robber wearing a green hat and another witness remembering the robber with a blue hat. These are different robberies at different banks where entirely different things happen. This isn't evidence. This is different people coming up with their own details to flesh out what was described in a few words in the early creed 20 years earlier. And so all of them coming up with their own story. I'm sorry, Gary. The Gospels don't back each other up, and there's nothing to be found outside the New Testament. What you call the one with the best evidence, I call for the Bible tells me so.
So why is he leaving out the appearance to the 12 when it's the best?
I don't accept it because the evidence is terrible.
And why is he trying to pick ones that are not evidenced as well?
Wait, are you trying to say that Paul's vision of Jesus isn't as well evidenced? If I accepted the Gospels and Acts, Gary's only sources for the appearance of the 12, as reliable, I could then point to the 3 different descriptions of Paul's Damascus Road experience and note that while they change the details, at least they try to describe the same event. Are you admitting that there's less evidence for Peter seeing Jesus, even though it's mentioned in Luke?
And, then it's divide and conquer, right? You divide these into little pieces, and then you go after the little pieces and say they're not pieces at all.
The little pieces are your so-called evidence. Am I simply supposed to be impressed that you come up with a long list of evidence, even though the individual items on the list don't withstand scrutiny? What exactly is the complaint here, Gary?
I don't think there's much of that theory. And the guys that I listed, only one of them still alive, as far as I know, of the 4 guys I listed.
At the time of this recording, Cupid and Spong are both alive, according to Wikipedia.
The theory's not popular anymore. And the theory's not popular because it's been blown out of the water by critics.
Among the most important New Testament scholars of the 20th century was Rudolf Bultmann, whom we've mentioned already, and whose work influenced the men Gary listed earlier. Now, among Bultmann's big ideas were existentialist philosophical interpretations of the Christian narrative and a theological approach called Demythologizing. the removal or reinterpretation of the mythological elements of a text like the Bible. And sure, the conclusions that Bultmann reached about the nature of God after he demythologized are no longer in fashion. Allowing Gary to be correct on a technicality, the relevant principle of demythologizing the Bible remains in play for scholars like John Dominic Crossan and the Jesus Seminar, James D.G. Gunn, A.J.M. Wedderburn, James Keller, Chester O'Gorman, frankly, the entire progressive Christianity movement, which is surging in influence, and even the likes of Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison, whom Gary will cite. As for Marxsen and Spong being blown out of the water by critics, what I found are objections to resurrection being a non-event, not objections to the sufficiency of Peter and Paul to propagate the message, the kerygma, into the church that exists today.
And you go, yeah, you're critics, people who teach at Liberty. No, people like Dale Allison.
I just got Dale Allison's new 2021 book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and I haven't had a chance to read through it all yet. But in the chapter on appearances, Allison is less bullish on the so-called appearance to the 12, and doesn't rule out the kind of thought experiment that I put forth.
Many treat the appearance to the 12 as though it were an appearance to an individual, as though a group shared a single mental event. Yet how can anyone know this? If, let us say, 2 or 3 of the disciples said that they had seen Jesus, maybe those who did not see him but thought they felt his presence would have gone along and been happy to be included in he appeared to the 12.
People like Bart Ehrman, people who get into the data, they're going to say the theory doesn't make any sense.
Professor Ehrman might not immediately endorse my proposition, but he's certainly not going to say it doesn't make sense. He famously thinks that even the most outlandish of naturalistic theories bear greater historical weight than the miraculous one Gary puts forth.
For example, the one that I've already laid out that he's ignored, that possibly 2 of Jesus' family members stole the body and that they were killed and thrown into a common tomb. It probably didn't happen, but it's more plausible than the explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead. Let me give you another explanation. Just off the top of my head from last night. Suppose Jesus had a twin brother. Nothing implausible. People have twins. After Jesus' death, Judas Thomas, like all others connected with Jesus, went into hiding and he escaped from Judea. Some years later, one of Jesus' followers saw Judas Thomas at a distance and he thought it was Jesus. Others reported similar sightings. Word spread that Jesus was no longer dead. The body in the tomb by that time had decomposed beyond recognition. The story became more widely accepted that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and in the oral traditions, more stories started up to be told about the event, including stories about them discovering an empty tomb. That's an alternative explanation. It's highly unlikely. I don't buy it for a second. But it's more likely than the idea that God raised Jesus from the dead because it doesn't appeal to the supernatural, which historians have no access to.
In fact, earlier in this same Q&A video, Gary answers his own question about the stance of the most prominent modern scholars, Dr. Ehrman in particular.
He says, I'm no longer going to take naturalistic theories. He says, I'm not going to pick one because he said, when I was an evangelical, he said, I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get me in a corner. I'm not going to be able to explain my way out. But since I picked that theory, I'm going to look stupid if I change my mind. So I think I'll just keep my mouth shut and say miracles don't happen, a la David Hume.
Exactly. The professional critics rarely hang their hat on a particular naturalistic theory, even if they favor one, because in the end, it isn't miracle theory versus specific natural theory X. Bart is doing the much broader work of miracle theory versus all natural theories, because the burden of proof is on the positive claim, the miracle. Now, for years, I've been hearing the whines of Christians wanting to improve their odds by going one-on-one with another positive claim. And a humble YouTuber like me can spend his hobby time putting forth a naturalistic champion to see how it fares. That the professionals in the field have bigger fish to fry says nothing about the veracity of my proposal. Gary is basically making an appeal to authority here, rather than actually put forth this alleged data that he asserts that I'm ignoring. If this data were strong, he'd present it, rather than merely scoffing incredulity and name-drop tangentially related works of dead men.
He could say it to his group if he wants to, but that's not what the critics are saying today.
Right. The critics are saying that your miracle case is so incapable of sufficiency on its own merit that there's little upside to endorsing specific alternatives. But again, my situation is different, and I think there's merit in using my current favorite alternative explanation specifically to demonstrate how flimsy the resurrection case is. And if one day one of the apologists actually comes up with a defeater to my hypothesis, beyond giggling and scoffing, then I can simply admit that they have a good point. No harm done.
It's kind of like cherry picking.
It is cherry picking. That's a great word. In fact, I think Bart Ehrman calls those views cherry picking views. You know what he calls them?
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
This is neat. He calls them the hermeneutics of convenience. I love it. That's Bart Ehrman. He says you don't like something, you ignore something. You like it, you make a big deal of it. And of course, you only like things that really don't go against you, and now you can take it down to size. I love that.
Gary thinks I'm cherry picking because he thinks I'm adopting parts of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed and ignoring others. But I'm not. I'm discounting it all as third-hand hearsay that merely codifies legend development. What I affirm is from other solid external sources. Meanwhile, Gary cites 4 scholars who, while agreeing with me generally that there was no bodily resurrection and that Peter and Paul were sufficient to kickstart Christianity, are no longer in vogue because of their unrelated theological stance, not because their historical observations were wrong. There's a famous saying, Mussolini made the trains run on time. If Gary applied his logic toward me, to Italy, he would say that accurate rail scheduling is no longer desired, because those fascist policies are now unpopular. And we'd be here all day if I wanted to put forth all the examples of Gary's selective credulity when it comes to near-death experiences, the Shroud of Turin, and the resurrection. The entire minimal facts approach that Gary champions is proudly based on cherry-picking some data and downplaying the rest. If you haven't heard my actual full resurrection hypothesis, rather than the question reader's selective summary, tap on the thumbnail on screen, and I'll see you over there. Later.